So Oppenheimer is a particularly good example of the elaboration of libertarian or anarchist class theory. And the categories that Oppenheimer uses are, in some sense, the ones most commonly used today. Oppenheimer talks about the distinction between the economic means of gaining wealth and the political means of gaining wealth. On the one hand, there's free creation and cooperative production and voluntary exchange. On the other hand, there's the use of force. Talk about the economic means, again, might suggest that we were concerned just with commercial exchange, and that's not what we're talking about here. So we might sometimes also talk about the civil or social means, because this includes volunteer work, it includes gift economies, anything that falls within the realm of voluntary exchange. By contrast, we can talk not just about the political means, but about the military means of gaining wealth. And that really highlights why I've included a reference to Oppenheimer here as I talk about the second problem with the state, not just illegitimacy, but also destructiveness. Because the state fundamentally depends on the use of force, and it uses force to take wealth from people and to pass it on to privileged elites. I've talked before about the way in which this played out in the history of England, history of the United States. The idea, again, is that force was used in English history to take land from people who had been working it often for generations, for centuries, and to assign title to that land to aristocratic cronies of those in power. And this happened in multiple stages in English history. It happened at the rise of feudalism. Folks who had been working the land suddenly continued to do so, but now without ownership. And we find the same thing, of course, happened in Latin America, where the great latifundias in Latin America are very often the products of violence that has turned independent individual families or communities of farmers into tenants of great aristocratic families. So there's that kind of violence. That's a crucial example. But also then with the enclosures then in later centuries in England, common grazing land becomes legally assigned to particular politically well-connected owners. Again, fundamentally a product of state force. It doesn't mean necessarily that the state used guns to people's heads to cause this to happen, but the threat of state violence was always there in the background. At that same time, as I mentioned before, the Industrial Revolution happens, and one thing that really did involve the state use of force was an internal passport system in England that limited people's travel, limited people's search for work outside a fairly narrow range of locations. Why? So that they couldn't compete for jobs and drive prices up. Instead, the new industrialists were able to benefit from the limitations that people confronted because they were forced to remain in geographically confined areas. So, first of all, the state's illegitimate. Second, the state's destructive. Third, the state is inefficient. And this is really the point that the Tannehills spend a great deal of time focusing on. They don't put it this way, but I think this is really the point of much of the Tannehills' argument. We can envision alternatives to the state that do the things the state does more efficiently. It's not surprising that monopolies are inefficient. We know this from experience. Monopoly power breeds inefficiency. Monopoly pricing involves the extraction of resources from ordinary people to the benefit of the monopolist. And so this ought not to surprise us at all. What happens, as the Tannehills emphasize, is that alternatives to the state, when they're put in place, create a level of efficiency and flexibility and responsiveness that really is vastly superior to what the state offers. If you think about the classic argument against state central planning offered by Mises and Hayek, Hayek in The Uses of Knowledge in Society, and by Mises in Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, in both cases, what's the fundamental argument? The fundamental argument is that central planners lack the information needed to make good decisions about the level of production and the patterns of distribution of goods and services. And the point is that while neither Mises nor Hayek drew this radical conclusion, this obviously applies to every single function the state provides. Every single function the state performs can be handled more efficiently than the state can in fact perform it. The fact is the state doesn't do this stuff well. And what the Tannehills are up to, as much as anything, is giving you an imaginative picture of how alternatives to the state could work. Now, it needs to be emphasized once again that there are other alternatives that they don't consider, and that's fine. What they are doing here, however, is highlighting for us how it might be the case that more efficient possibilities could work. Okay? And I think it's quite clear that there can be more efficient possibilities by far. The central planners can't do a good job, and that's true whether they're providing school services, whether they're providing water services, or whether they're providing defense and the legal system. So the Tannehills want to highlight this possibility in a very clear, dramatic, imaginative way, and so they provide a lot of detailed information, and I think that's all to the good. So that's what we've been up to so far, it seems to me, in this class. We've looked at the underlying undesirability of the state, and the Tannehills have begun to spell out in considerable detail what they think the most important institutions of a stateless society might look like, the institutions providing protection against risk, protection against harm. And I think it's really crucial that we think about the bravery, the courage that they've shown by being willing to stick their necks out and do this. A lot of us are much more willing to talk about why the state clearly doesn't work and why a priori we know that some alternative has to be better than we are actually at spelling out what makes a particular stateless alternative attractive. Now, as we review what the Tannehills have to say, we may conclude in particular cases that their model isn't very attractive. And certainly those who are concerned about their kind of objectivist flavor, for instance, may not be very enthusiastic about what they have to say in one place or another. But I think it's important to honor their courageous willingness to stick their necks out and talk about possibilities in fairly concrete ways. And also I think it's important to recognize that nobody in the real world, perhaps some people in Ayn Rand novels, but nobody in the real world is in fact one-dimensional.